Greetings all, and welcome to the second of our lectures on sexology. In our last class, we learned a little bit about sexology's founders and about the impact that scientific developments of the 19th century, particularly Darwin's theory of evolution, had on this new field. We saw how Darwin's biologization of sex set the stage for sexology's medicalization of sex. And looking beyond the world of evolutionary biology, we also saw how the more general cultural climate of the Victorian era shaped sexology's early attempts to theorize sexual desire and behavior. In this lecture, I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit more. What other kinds of cultural phenomena of the late 19th and early 20th century shaped the formation of sexological theories and practices? As we address these questions, we're going to see that in their attempts to understand human sexuality, sexologists drew heavily upon prevailing ideas surrounding gender, race, and age. An exploration of these intersections demonstrates how indebted early Western sexology was to 19th century racial science, to eugenics, and to emerging conceptions of childhood. All of these things left a deep imprint upon the field. And so, our questions for today are 1, 2, and 3. As we've seen from our discussions thus far, one of the most interesting things about sexology was its belief that there were distinct types of sexuality, and that people could be classified according to their sexual desires and behaviors. Sexological neologisms like the homosexual and the heterosexual represented an attempt to categorize the various kinds of human sexual species believed to inhabit the world. This was a very new idea. Prior to the 19th century, specific sexual cravings and acts were not thought to be the province of particular kinds of individuals. Same-sex sexual attraction was not believed to reveal anything fundamental about the person who experienced or acted upon that attraction, for example. But this was not the case for sexologists. According to them, our sexual likes and dislikes spoke of things deep inside us. We had sexual natures that were innate and fixed, that were the products of inheritance, that is, our genetic endowment. It is not a coincidence that in the late 1800s, sexuality came to be biologized in this manner. Indeed, the late 1800s was a period marked by the ascendance of nature, which assumed pride of place in explanations of all different kinds of human behavior. And one of the foremost proponents of this idea that our identities and personalities were biologically determined was eugenics. The term eugenics was coined by the English thinker Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. Coming from a combination of two Greek words that mean well-born, eugenics could be translated as the science of human improvement, which Galton and other eugenicists wanted to achieve via controlled breeding. He and his followers believed that the most pressing problems of the day could be solved biologically because, as eugenicists had it, things like crime, poverty, and illness were the result of traits passed down hereditarily from one generation to the next. Thus, by controlling human reproduction so that people with quote-unquote undesirable traits would have fewer children, and those with quote-unquote desirable traits more children, eventually things like criminality and disease could be effectively bred out of the population. These ideas had widespread appeal all across the world, and were eagerly taken up by Western governments in particular, which created dozens of new laws and policies designed to counter eugenicists' worst fear, a dystopian future in which, quote-unquote, inferior peoples, namely immigrants, the poor, racial minorities, and the disabled, ruled over society. As this suggests, eugenics was incredibly elitist. Its supporters saw privilege and high social status as a sign of eugenic fitness, and when asked who the wrong kind of people were, they often pointed to non-whites, the urban working classes, the disadvantaged, and women. Raising the cry of race suicide, they chastised middle and upper class white women for not having enough babies, and called upon them to practice a warfare of the cradle. As this suggests, women bore the brunt of eugenicists' ire. What particularly unsettled eugenicists was the women's rights movement. During the 19th century, increasing numbers of middle-class white women began to agitate for a greater public presence in society, arguing for the right to vote and hold political office, for the right to a university education and academic employment, for more liberal divorce laws, and for various other causes. All of these demands posed a challenge to the existing patriarchal order, and in response to them, many male doctors invoked the doctrine of separate spheres, that is, the idea that nature had created the private domestic realm for women and the public social realm for men. According to this argument, women who sought an advanced education, the right to vote, or tried to make inroads into previously all-male occupations were damaging their reproductive organs and unfitting themselves for their primary responsibilities as child-rearers and homemakers. Sexology was part of this backlash against the burgeoning feminism of the era. First, sexologists upheld the sexual double standard that many feminists railed against, arguing that whereas men were naturally sexually voracious and promiscuous, women were by nature asexual. Obviously, this argument could be used to defend men's sexual infidelity as natural. Second, sexologists often argued that women who pushed for greater freedoms were quote-unquote mannish and exhibited atavistic tendencies more characteristic of women at an earlier stage of the human species' development. The words lesbian and sexual invert were also frequently hurled at these women, and this also served to underscore the sexologists' argument that feminists were evolutionary throwbacks who had failed to properly recapitulate their evolutionary pathways. The biases evident in some circles of sexological thought were not only sexist, so too were they racist. And these two things intersected in a very visible way. In order to understand this, we need to first learn a little bit about Western racial science. European racial theorizing dates back to the beginnings of European colonization, in other words, to the 15th and 16th centuries. From the very beginnings of European imperialism, Europeans imagined themselves as superior to the peoples they conquered, be they in the Americas, Africa, the Pacific, Asia, or the Middle East. But up until the late 19th century, Europeans believed that their superiority was a cultural phenomenon, something explained by their supposedly better educational systems, laws, or political systems. In the late 19th century, however, Europeans' ideology of dominance shifted from culture to biology. After 1870 or so, they increasingly believed that biological factors explained their success as conquerors and colonizers. As this shift occurred, new scientific disciplines emerged with the express purpose of finding the biological causes of white supremacy. One of these disciplines was craniometry, which was grounded in the theory that intelligence was determined by the size or shape of one's skull, and that these things varied by racial group. Not surprisingly, craniometrists found that African and Asian skulls were smaller than European ones. Concluding that their colonial subjects were stuck at a level of intellectual development characteristic of most white children, doctors used craniometry as a tool of empire. After all, they argued, if the colonized could not advance beyond the level of a child, they would need Europeans, as the only true mature adults in the world, to govern them. These kinds of racist assumptions found expression in sexology as well. When looking for reasons to explain their superiority, Western scientists often focused on sexual anatomy. For example, when talking about what made them different compared to Africans, European scientists fixated on things like the size of women's genitalia, writing in an incredibly derogatory, racist way about non-European peoples. They regarded Africans as less biologically evolved, and as evidence for this, they argued that African males and females had very similar anatomical and physiological characteristics compared to Europeans, who were supposedly more sexually differentiated. All of these ideas can be seen in sexology. For example, those who believed that lesbians represented a primitive evolutionary throwback often argued that they had abnormally large clitorises, just as was said of African women. The parallel drawn between lesbians' bodies and those of African women demonstrate the impact that Darwinian evolutionary thought had on sexology, while also illustrating the racist and sexist biases evident in some circles of sexological thought. If ideas about gender and race shaped early sexology, so too did ideas about age. Up until the 18th century, European societies saw children as lusty creatures whose sexual desires needed to be monitored and policed. But in the 18th century, a new conception of children as sexually pure emerged. During the 19th century, this idea that children were naturally asexual spread, and increasingly, children were said to be in need of protection from adult sexual predators. In the 1880s and 1890s, stories of children's sexual exploitation circulated widely in European newspapers. Medical doctors also discussed sexual acts committed by adult men against young boys and girls. Out of this came attempts to prevent male and female youths from physical molestation and sexual seduction. In 1885, for example, the British Parliament passed a law raising the age of consent for girls from 13 to 16. All of this had a formative impact on sexology. The construction of the new category of homosexuality was strongly influenced by concerns about child sexual abuse. As European societies became increasingly hostile to the idea of cross-generational love, sexologists endeavored to separate out pederasty from other forms of same-sex sexual desire and behavior. In his writings, for example, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs coined the term Uranian in part because he wanted to distinguish his conception of homosexuality from prevailing ideas of Greek love as pedophilia. Following this, in his A Problem in Modern Ethics, John Simmons separated homosexuals into three types: manlings, weeblings, and Mittelernings. Those in the latter two categories, Simmons argued, exhibited sexual behaviors that were healthy and congenital, whereas manlings were perverts, as he put it, quote, old debauchees or half-idiotic individuals who are in the habit of misusing boys. Finally, in 1914, Magnus Hirschfeld coined the term pedophilic homosexual, a category created to reject the idea that age-differentiated desires were characteristic of all same-sex relations. Instead, now, homosexuality was presented as a gender-based attraction between men. The new category of homosexuality excluded those whose desires were directed toward younger partners. Looking to present an acceptable form of same-sex sexual relations, sexologists insisted that homosexuals were driven by gendered desires, not by a desire for youths. Now understood in gendered terms, homosexuality was presented through the rubric of sexual inversion. This is something we're going to talk about as we get to our next assigned reading of the semester. For now, once you've got a good grasp on all of the content from this lecture, please head over to the discussion board and address any of the questions on the second slide. I look forward to reading your comments, and we'll see you all in the discussion board. See you later, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now.